There is a misunderstanding about empathy in our culture. We tend to romanticize it. We call it kindness. We call it sensitivity. We call it being a good person. But very often what we label as empathy is not simply compassion, it is adaptation. For many empaths, their heightened sensitivity was not a choice. It was a necessity. As children, they learned to read the emotional weather of the room the way others check a forecast. They tracked tone of voice, micro-expressions, tension in the body, not because they were gifted, but because their safety depended on it. When a child grows up in an environment where their own emotions are not consistently welcomed, they learn something profound. My needs are dangerous, but if I take care of yours, I might belong. So empathy becomes a survival strategy. Over time, this child becomes the adult who is always available. The one who listens at midnight, the one who absorbs everyone as pain, the one who regulates other people as anxiety simply by being present. They become the emotional stabilizer in families, friendships, and relationships. But here is what we rarely examine. When someone becomes the emotional regulator for others, others begin to depend on that regulation. Human nervous systems are social. We co-regulate, we calm each other. When an empath is constantly attuned, they are offering a steady, reassuring presence. People feel safe around them. But sometimes that safety is not rooted in mutual connection. It is rooted in dependency. So what happens when the empath stops being available? Panic. Not because the empath has done something wrong, but because the system has been disrupted. When the empath sets a boundary, declines a call, or no longer rushes to soothe, the people around them may feel an unexpected surge of anxiety. It can look like anger. It can sound like accusation. It can feel like rejection. You've changed. You are being selfish. You don't care anymore. But what is really happening beneath those reactions? A nervous system that had outsourced its regulation is suddenly left alone with its own discomfort. And discomfort, especially when it traces back to early attachment wounds, can feel intolerable. We must understand this clearly. When someone panics at your boundary, it does not automatically mean you have harmed them. It may mean they are confronting a part of themselves they have long avoided. For the empath, this moment is deeply destabilizing because from childhood, they equated love with availability. They equated worth with usefulness. They equated connection with self-abandonment. So when others panic, the old programming activates. I must fix this. I must soothe them. I must go back to being who they need me to be. And yet, healing asks something radically different. Healing asks the empath to tolerate someone else as discomfort without rushing to erase it. This is extraordinarily difficult. It triggers guilt. And guilt, for the empath, is not a small emotion. It is existential. It whispers, if they are upset, I am unsafe. If they are disappointed, I will be abandoned. But boundaries are not abandonment, they are differentiation. When the empath begins to turn their attention inward to ask, what do I feel? What do I need? They are not becoming cold, they are becoming integrated. And integration changes relational dynamics. Some relationships will deepen because they were rooted in authenticity. Others will fracture because they were rooted in imbalance. When an empath stops being endlessly available, people who benefited from that imbalance may panic. They may try to re-establish the old dynamic through guilt, criticism, or emotional pressure. But panic is not proof of betrayal. It is proof that a pattern is being disrupted, and disruption is often the first step toward growth. The deeper truth is this: a relationship that depends on one person as self-abandonment is not intimacy. It is survival disguised as love. True connection requires two regulated nervous systems. Two people capable of holding their own pain. Two people who can say, I care about you, without meaning, I will disappear for you. When the empath reclaims their energy, something profound happens. They discover that their value was never in their availability, it was in their presence. And presence does not require self-erasure. There is a quiet power in saying no without anger, in stepping back without hostility, in loving without overextending. The panic of others is not the empath. It's responsibility to cure. Each of us must learn to sit with our own unmet needs, our own attachment fears, our own loneliness. When we rely entirely on another person to shield us from those feelings, we prevent our own maturation. So if you are an empath who is learning to be less available, understand this: the discomfort around you is not necessarily a sign that you are doing something wrong. It may be a sign that you are finally doing something different. And different can feel threatening, especially to those who were comfortable with the old version of you. But growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. When empathy includes the self, it becomes sustainable. When compassion extends inward, it becomes strength. And when availability becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, relationships become real. The panic of others is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of honesty. And honesty, though uncomfortable, is the soil where true love grows. We often speak of empathy as though it were a charming feature of personality, like having a good sense of humor or being naturally optimistic. We praise the empath as though they were simply born softer, kinder, more attuned than others. But in many cases, what we call empathy is not merely temperament. It is adaptation. It is the nervous system's intelligent response to an environment where emotional safety was uncertain. A child does not develop heightened sensitivity in a vacuum. The brain and body are shaped in relationship. When a child grows up in a home where caregivers are unpredictable, overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or volatile, the child's survival depends on reading the emotional atmosphere accurately and quickly. The child becomes hyper-aware of tone shifts, facial tension, pauses in speech, subtle changes in posture. This vigilance is not a hobby, it is protection. If mother is anxious, the child must become soothing. If father is angry, the child must become compliant. If a caregiver is depressed, the child may attempt to become cheerful or invisible. The child learns that their own spontaneous emotional expression may create more instability, so they suppress their anger, mute their sadness, silence their needs. Instead, they focus outward. Who is upset? Who needs calming? Who must not be disturbed? Over time, this outward orientation becomes automatic. The child is praised for being mature, sensitive, easygoing, understanding. Adults may say, "You are so empathetic for your age." But what they are often witnessing is a nervous system organized around threat detection and emotional management. This is not a character flaw, it is brilliance. The child does exactly what is necessary to maintain connection, because connection equals survival. For a young human, losing attachment feels life-threatening. So the child sacrifices authenticity to preserve belonging. When that child grows into adulthood, the strategy remains. They enter relationships already attuned to everyone else's feelings. They sense tension before words are spoken. They offer support before it is requested. They anticipate needs before they are expressed. And others are drawn to this presence. It feels safe, reassuring, warm. But beneath the warmth there may be exhaustion, because when empathy is rooted in survival, it is rarely balanced by self-attunement. The empath may know exactly how their partner feels, yet struggle to identify their own emotional state. They may sit with a friend as grief for hours but feel discomfort when asked, "What do you need right now?" The body remembers what the mind rationalizes away. Chronic hypervigilance keeps the nervous system activated. There is little true rest. Even in calm moments, there can be a subtle scanning of readiness to respond. Over time, this can manifest as burnout, resentment, or a sense of invisibility. It is important to distinguish healthy empathy from survival empathy. Healthy empathy arises from a regulated nervous system. It allows connection without self-erasure. One can feel with another person while remaining grounded in oneself. Survival empathy, on the other hand, is driven by fear. It is motivated by the unconscious belief that if others are upset, I am at risk. In adulthood, this belief may not be consciously acknowledged. Instead, it appears as guilt when setting boundaries, as anxiety when someone is disappointed, as an almost compulsive urge to fix conflict immediately. The old childhood equation remains active: harmony equals safety. Yet genuine intimacy requires something different. It requires two individuals who can each tolerate discomfort without collapsing or overfunctioning. When an empath begins to question their constant availability, they may feel disoriented. If I am not the caretaker, who am I? If I do not anticipate every emotional shift, will I still be loved? This questioning is not selfishness. It is maturation. The task is not to eliminate empathy, but to integrate it. To bring the same sensitivity that was directed outward back toward the self. To ask, what am I feeling in this moment? Where does my body feel tight? What emotion have I been overriding? Reclaiming self-attunement can initially feel unnatural. The nervous system may interpret it as danger. There may be waves of guilt or fear. But these sensations are echoes of earlier experiences, not present threats. As adults, we have more resources, more autonomy, more capacity than we did as children. When empathy is freed from its survival roots, it transforms. It becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. One can offer presence without abandoning boundaries. One can care deeply without taking responsibility for another as emotional regulation. Understanding empathy as a childhood survival strategy does not diminish its beauty, it deepens it. It honors the intelligence of the child who adapted so skillfully, and it invites the adult to evolve beyond adaptation into authenticity. The goal is not to become less empathetic, it is to become whole, to allow empathy to flow in both directions, to recognize that true compassion includes the self. When empathy is grounded in self-awareness rather than fear, it ceases to be a burden. It becomes strength rooted in choice, not in survival. But we tend to admire the person who is always emotionally available, the one who answers late-night calls, who listens without interruption, who senses distress before it is spoken. We call them supportive, nurturing, selfless. But emotional availability is not always a freely chosen virtue. For many, it is a learned response shaped by early attachment wounds. Attachment begins in infancy. A child depends entirely on caregivers not only for food and shelter, but for emotional regulation. When a caregiver responds consistently and warmly, the child's nervous system learns that connection is safe. But when responses are inconsistent, intrusive, distant, or unpredictable, the child adapts. The body and brain reorganize around one central question: how do I maintain closeness in order to survive? In some homes, emotional expression was discouraged. A parent may have been overwhelmed, depressed, anxious, or carrying unresolved trauma of their own. The child quickly learns that their sadness burdens others, their anger creates distance, their needs risk rejection, and so the child becomes vigilant. They study the caregiver's moods, they anticipate reactions, they soften their voice, they become agreeable, they offer comfort long before they receive it. What we later call emotional availability often begins here, not as generosity but as strategy. The child discovers that by being attuned to others they can preserve attachment. If I sense your distress and soothe you, you will not withdraw. If I make myself useful, you will not abandon me. If I manage your emotions, I will remain safe. This adaptation is intelligent. It reflects the profound drive for connection that defines human development. But it comes at a cost. The child's internal world becomes secondary. Self-attunement is replaced by other attunement. Instead of asking, what do I feel? The nervous system asks, what do you feel and how should I respond? Over time, this pattern solidifies. In adolescence and adulthood, the person becomes known as the emotionally available one. Friends seek them out during crisis. Partners lean on them for stability. Colleagues rely on their calm presence. Outwardly, this looks like strength. Inwardly, it may feel like constant responsibility. Emotional availability rooted in attachment wounds carries urgency. It is not simply kindness, it is vigilance. The individual may feel uneasy when someone around them is upset. Silence can feel threatening. Conflict might trigger disproportionate anxiety. There's often an unconscious belief that relational harmony depends entirely on their responsiveness. This is the residue of early attachment insecurity. The body remembers what the mind has normalized. If a caregiver's withdrawal once felt catastrophic, any hint of disconnection in adult relationships can activate the same fear. So the individual moves quickly to repair, reassure, and restore equilibrium. But healthy emotional availability is different. It arises from internal security rather than fear of loss. It allows space. It respects boundaries. It recognizes that each person is responsible for their own emotional regulation. When availability is driven by attachment wounds, it tends to override these distinctions. The person may struggle to say no. They may prioritize others' needs automatically. They may feel guilt when choosing rest over responsiveness. They may even attract relationships where their availability is expected but not reciprocated. This dynamic reinforces the original wound, the belief that love must be earned through caretaking. At its core, this pattern reflects a child's attempt to solve an unsolvable problem. No child can heal a caregiver's trauma. No child can guarantee permanent closeness, yet many tried. They learned to scan for microexpressions, shifts in tone, subtle cues of distress. Their nervous systems became exquisitely sensitive. In adulthood, this sensitivity can be reframed. It is not weakness. It is capacity shaped under pressure. But healing requires redirecting some of that availability inward. It requires asking difficult questions. What happens in my body when someone is disappointed with me? Why does another's anger feel like a personal failure? When did I first learn that I must manage emotions to stay connected? As these questions unfold, a new possibility emerges. Emotional availability can become a choice rather than an obligation. The individual can remain compassionate without absorbing responsibility for everyone's feelings. They can tolerate moments of relational discomfort without rushing to fix them. This shift may initially destabilize relationships built on the old dynamic. Others may experience the new boundaries as withdrawal, but true connection cannot depend on one person as overextension. Mutuality requires two adults capable of holding their own internal experiences. To understand emotional availability as a learned response to attachment wounds is not to dismiss it. It is to contextualize it. It honors the child who adapted so skillfully to preserve love. And it invites the adult to evolve beyond survival into authenticity. When availability is grounded in self-awareness, it becomes sustainable. It no longer arises from fear of abandonment, but from genuine care. It allows closeness without self-erasure. It permits presence without compulsion. Healing does not require becoming distant or indifferent. It requires integration. The same sensitivity that once protected attachment can now support balanced relationships. The difference lies in choice. When emotional availability is no longer driven by unresolved wounds, it transforms from survival strategy into conscious connection rooted in inner security that human beings are not designed to regulate alone. From infancy, our nervous systems develop in relationship. A baby cannot calm itself without the steady presence of a caregiver. The caregiver's voice, facial expression, touch, and tone provide cues of safety. This process, known as co-regulation, becomes the foundation for emotional stability. In healthy development, co-regulation gradually leads to self-regulation. The child internalizes the caregiver as soothing responses and learns to calm themselves. But when this process is incomplete, inconsistent, or disrupted, the individual may reach adulthood still seeking external nervous system support. This is where the empath often enters the dynamic. An empath, especially one shaped by early hypervigilance, carries a highly attuned nervous system. They sense emotional shifts quickly. They soften their tone when tension rises. They instinctively validate feelings. Their presence communicates safety. For someone who struggles with self-regulation, this can feel profoundly relieving. When the empath listens deeply, mirrors emotions, and remains calm in conflict, the other person's nervous system settles, heart rate slows, breathing stabilizes, anxiety decreases. Without fully realizing it, the other person begins associating the empath with emotional relief. Relief is powerful. The brain is wired to seek it. Over time, a pattern can form. Whenever distress arises, the individual turns to the empath. Instead of learning to sit with discomfort, reflect internally, or develop self-soothing tools, they reach outward. The empath becomes the regulator, the stabilizer, the emotional anchor. This dynamic does not necessarily begin with manipulation. It often arises unconsciously. The person experiencing anxiety or emotional volatility may not even realize they lack self-regulation skills. They simply know that being around the empath feels better, but dependence develops subtly. If someone consistently relies on another nervous system to calm their own, they may not cultivate internal resilience. When the empath is present, they feel steady. When the empath withdraws, distress intensifies. This can create a fragile equilibrium. The empath may feel valued, needed, even indispensable. For someone whose early survival depended on being useful, this role feels familiar. It reinforces identity. I am the one who keeps things together. I am the calm in the storm. Yet beneath that identity lies exhaustion. Because regulating another adult as nervous system on a regular basis is not a small task. It requires constant attunement. It demands emotional labor. The empath may suppress their own rising stress in order to maintain stability for the other person. Meanwhile, the dependent individual may unconsciously outsource responsibility. Instead of asking, "Why does conflict overwhelm me?" they ask, "Why aren't you helping me calm down?" Instead of developing coping strategies, they expect reassurance. Instead of tolerating emotional discomfort, they seek immediate soothing. The root of this dependency often traces back to attachment history. If early caregivers did not consistently model self-regulation, the individual may not have internalized those skills. In adulthood, they gravitate toward partners or friends who embody what they lack. The empath as nervous system becomes the borrowed stability. This dynamic can intensify during stress. In moments of crisis, the dependent person may become clingy, reactive, or accusatory if the empath is unavailable. The withdrawal of regulation feels threatening. It can trigger panic responses that resemble abandonment fears from childhood. For the empath, this reaction is confusing and painful. They may feel responsible for the other's emotional state. They may rush back into the regulating role to restore calm. The cycle continues. But true emotional maturity requires differentiation. Each person must develop the capacity to regulate their own internal world. Co-regulation is healthy when it is mutual and temporary. It becomes problematic when it is one-sided and chronic. Understanding why others grow dependent on the empath as nervous system regulation is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing a relational pattern shaped by unmet developmental needs. When the empath begins to step back, the dependent individual faces an unfamiliar task. They must sit with discomfort without immediate relief. They must confront anxiety without external soothing. This can initially amplify distress, but it also creates an opportunity for growth. The empath, too, faces a challenge. Letting go of the regulator role can trigger guilt and fear. If I am not calming them, am I failing them? But emotional responsibility cannot remain outsourced indefinitely. Healthy relationships involve two regulated adults who can support each other without collapsing into dependency. When both individuals take ownership of their nervous systems, connection becomes balanced rather than burdened. The empath's calm presence is a gift, but it is not meant to replace another person's inner work. When dependency shifts toward mutual accountability, both individuals gain strength. The empath is freed from chronic overfunctioning. The other person develops resilience. In this shift, relationships move from survival patterns into conscious connection. Regulation becomes shared, not extracted, and both nervous systems learn that safety does not require one person carrying the emotional weight for two. When an empath begins to withdraw, even slightly, the reaction around them can feel disproportionate. A delayed reply, boundaries set calmly, a refusal to absorb emotional intensity the way they once did can trigger waves of anxiety, anger, or accusation in others. On the surface, it may appear dramatic. Beneath the surface, it is often a panic response rooted in attachment dynamics and nervous system dependency. Human beings are wired for connection. From infancy, safety is associated with proximity to a regulating presence. If, over time, someone has come to rely heavily on the empath as that regulating presence, the empath's availability becomes intertwined with their sense of stability. The empath is not just a partner or friend. They are the emotional anchor. When that anchor shifts, the body reacts before the mind understands. The panic response is not usually conscious manipulation. It is a physiological activation. The nervous system detects change and interprets as potential threat. Heart rate increases. Thoughts race. Old fears surface. If early experiences included inconsistent caregiving or emotional abandonment, those memories are encoded somatically. The present withdrawal touches the past wound. The individual may not think, I am afraid of losing my regulator. Instead, the reaction appears as blame. You have changed. You are distant. You do not care the way you used to. These statements are often defenses against deeper vulnerability. The unspoken fear is, I do not know how to steady myself without you. For the empath, this reaction can be deeply destabilizing. They may question their decision to step back. Guilt emerges quickly. The old conditioning whispers that harmony must be restored at any cost. The empath feels the other person as distress in their own body, which intensifies the urge to fix the situation immediately. But the panic response reveals something important about the previous dynamic. It suggests that the relationship may have been organized around imbalance. One nervous system consistently overfunctioned while the other underdeveloped its capacity for self-regulation. When the empath withdraws, the underfunctioning becomes visible. The panic may escalate because the individual has not practiced tolerating emotional discomfort independently. Without the empath, a soothing tone, validating words, or stabilizing presence, anxiety feels raw and uncontained. The withdrawal forces confrontation with internal states that were previously buffered. In some cases, this confrontation is growth-inducing. The individual begins to develop new coping skills. They seek therapy, cultivate self-awareness, learn breathing techniques, or build a broader support system. In other cases, the panic hardens into resentment. The empath is pressured to return to their former role. The intensity of the reaction often mirrors the depth of dependency. Attachment theory offers insight here. When early bonds were insecure, especially anxious, any sign of distance can activate profound fear. The nervous system reverts to earlier strategies: protest, cling, accuse, demand reassurance. These strategies once served to maintain proximity to caregivers. In adulthood, they reappear in romantic and close relationships. The empath's withdrawal disrupts this familiar pattern. It is important to recognize that withdrawal does not necessarily mean abandonment. For the empath, stepping back may represent integration. It may be an attempt to restore balance, conserve energy, or reclaim authenticity. But to someone whose security depended on constant attunement, it can feel like rejection. This mismatch in perception fuels conflict. The empath may say, I need space. The other hears, I am leaving you. The empath may say, I cannot take this on right now. The other hears, your emotions are too much. These distortions are not deliberate. They arise from unresolved attachment fears. Understanding the panic response does not mean excusing harmful behavior. If panic manifests as control, hostility, or emotional coercion, boundaries remain essential. But insight allows compassion without self-erasure. The empath can acknowledge the fear beneath the reaction while still maintaining their limits. True relational growth requires both parties to examine their roles. The empath must explore why constant availability felt necessary. The other must explore why autonomy feels threatening. Withdrawal, though uncomfortable, can become a catalyst for this reflection. Over time, if both individuals are willing, the panic subsides. The nervous system adapts to a new equilibrium. The relationship reorganizes around mutual regulation rather than one-sided stabilization. If unwilling, the relationship may dissolve, revealing that it was sustained more by dependency than by reciprocity. The panic response when the empath withdraws is not random. It is the nervous system's alarm at the loss of a familiar stabilizer. But alarms are signals, not verdicts. They point to unmet developmental needs, unexamined fears, and opportunities for maturation. When handled with awareness, the moment of withdrawal can shift a relationship from survival patterns toward conscious connection. It challenges both individuals to develop internal stability rather than relying exclusively on the other. And in that challenge lies the possibility of healthier attachment, where closeness is chosen freely rather than clung to out of fear. For many sensitive and empathetic individuals, guilt is not a fleeting emotion. It is a reflex. The moment they assert a boundary, decline a request, or prioritize their own needs, a wave of discomfort rises in the body. The mind begins to question the decision. Was that too harsh? Am I being selfish? Did I hurt them? Beneath these thoughts lies something deeper than simple concern. There is often a fear of abandonment. Boundaries are a healthy expression of self-definition. They clarify where one person ends and another begins. They protect energy, time, and emotional well-being. In secure relationships, boundaries strengthen connection because they create honesty. But for someone whose early attachment experiences were unstable, boundaries can feel dangerous. In childhood, love may have been conditional. Approval may have depended on compliance. Emotional closeness may have required self-suppression. The child learned that saying no risked distance. Expressing anger risked withdrawal. Having needs risked rejection. So the safest strategy became accommodation. Over time, accommodation becomes identity. The person sees themselves as easygoing, generous, always available. Others reinforce this image. They praise the willingness to help, the patience, the understanding nature. What goes unseen is the internal cost. Each unspoken no becomes stored tension. Each overridden need becomes quiet resentment. When this person begins to set boundaries in adulthood, the nervous system reacts as if it is breaking an ancient rule. The body may feel tight. The heart may race. Guilt arises almost instantly. But the guilt is not necessarily evidence of wrongdoing. It is often a conditioned response to differentiation. Differentiation is the capacity to remain connected while being separate. It allows someone to say, I care about you and I cannot do this right now. For individuals with abandonment wounds, separation once equaled loss, so any movement toward autonomy triggers fear. Guilt becomes the emotional bridge between boundary and fear. It whispers that love will be withdrawn if the boundary stands. It urges reconciliation, softening, retreat. The mind may replay the other person as reaction repeatedly. A slight change in tone can be interpreted as looming rejection. This is the echo of earlier experiences, not necessarily the reality of the present moment. The fear of abandonment often operates beneath awareness. It does not always appear as dramatic anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as chronic over-explaining, as apologizing for reasonable limits, as feeling responsible for managing how others feel about the boundary. The paradox is that without boundaries, relationships become fragile. When one person consistently abandons themselves to preserve connection, intimacy erodes. There is closeness but not authenticity. The self becomes blurred. Over time, resentment builds quietly, even if it is never expressed. Guilt convinces the person that maintaining harmony is the highest priority. But harmony built on self-erasure is unstable. It requires constant self-sacrifice. It teaches others that access to one's time and energy is unlimited. And it reinforces the internal belief that love must be earned. Healing involves recognizing that guilt can be a false alarm. The nervous system may activate simply because something new is happening. Setting a boundary disrupts an old relational pattern. The discomfort is real, but it does not automatically signal danger. Learning to tolerate this discomfort is a developmental task. It requires pausing rather than retracting the boundary. It requires reminding oneself that another person, as disappointment, is not equivalent to abandonment. Adults are capable of experiencing frustration without severing connection. This does not mean boundaries will always be received gracefully. Some relationships are organized around compliance. When limits are introduced, resistance can surface. In such cases, the fear of abandonment may intensify because the relationship itself may shift. But even then, the deeper question remains: is connection sustainable if it depends on self-betrayal? As individuals strengthen their internal sense of worth, guilt gradually transforms. It becomes information rather than command. They can examine it with curiosity. What part of me feels unsafe right now? When did I first learn that asserting myself meant losing love? With awareness, boundaries become less charged. They are no longer acts of rebellion. They are expressions of clarity. And clarity invites more authentic relationships. The fear of abandonment loses its grip. When one begins to experience the connection can survive honesty. When others respond with respect rather than withdrawal, the nervous system updates its expectations. Even when some relationships fall away, new ones form on healthier foundations. Guilt, boundaries, and the fear of abandonment are deeply intertwined in those shaped by insecure attachment. But growth lies in recognizing that love and autonomy are not opposites. They can coexist. A boundary does not signal rejection. It signals self-recognition. When the individual learns to remain present with their guilt without surrendering their limits, something shifts internally. The boundary stands. The fear softens, and connection, when it continues, becomes chosen rather than clung to. For many who have lived as emotional caretakers, healing does not begin with changing others. It begins with turning inward. Self-attunement is the practice of listening to one's own internal experience with the same sensitivity that was once reserved for everyone else. It is subtle, often unfamiliar, and at first deeply uncomfortable. Yet it is the doorway to emotional sovereignty. Self-attunement means noticing what is happening inside the body before reacting outwardly. It is pausing long enough to ask, what am I feeling right now? Where do I sense tension? Is this anxiety mine, or have I absorbed it from someone else? These questions may seem simple, but for someone conditioned to scan the emotional environment constantly, they represent a radical shift of attention. As children, many learned that monitoring others was essential for safety. Their nervous systems became finely tuned instruments of external awareness. Over time, internal signals were muted. Hunger, fatigue, anger, disappointment were overridden to maintain connection. This pattern can persist into adulthood, creating a life organized around responsiveness rather than authenticity. Healing requires gently reversing that orientation. At first, self-attunement may reveal discomfort that has long been suppressed. There may be grief for unmet needs. There may be anger at boundaries that were never allowed. There may be fear that prioritizing oneself will lead to rejection. Emotional sovereignty does not mean eliminating these feelings. It means acknowledging them without judgment. Emotional sovereignty is the recognition that one's internal state belongs to oneself. It is the understanding that while relationships influence us, they do not define us. When someone is upset, we can care without absorbing responsibility. When someone is disappointed, we can empathize without collapsing into guilt. This shift is not achieved through force. It unfolds through consistent practice, small moments of checking in, small acts of honoring fatigue, small boundaries expressed calmly. Each act sends a new message to the nervous system. My feelings matter. My needs are legitimate. I am allowed to exist as a separate emotional being. Self-attunement strengthens self-regulation. When we identify emotions early, we can respond rather than react. Instead of suppressing frustration until it becomes resentment, we can address it directly. Instead of ignoring exhaustion until burnout, we can rest. This responsiveness to self reduces the compulsion to overextend for others. Reclaiming emotional sovereignty also changes relational dynamics. Others may notice the difference. The person who once absorbed tension now names it. The one who always said yes now pauses. Some relationships will adapt and deepen, appreciating the increased clarity. Others may resist, having benefited from the previous imbalance. This resistance can test the commitment to sovereignty. Old fears may resurface. Am I becoming selfish? Will they leave? The work here is to remain grounded in self-awareness rather than retreating into old patterns. Sovereignty does not require harshness. It requires steadiness. Part of healing involves redefining empathy. Empathy does not mean merging with another's emotional state. It means understanding it while staying rooted in oneself. When empathy includes self-attunement, it becomes sustainable. It no longer drains vitality. It nourishes connection. The body plays a central role in this process. Emotional sovereignty is not purely cognitive. It is embodied. Practices that reconnect attention to breath, posture, and sensation help restore internal awareness. When the body feels safe, boundaries feel less threatening. When the nervous system is regulated, Saying no does not feel catastrophic. Over time, self-attunement fosters trust in one's internal signals. Decisions become clearer. Relationships feel more balanced. There is less urgency to fix, rescue, or prove worth. Identity shifts from being the emotional anchor for others to being a whole person in mutual exchange. This transformation is gradual. There will be moments of regression. There will be situations that trigger old reflexes. Healing does not erase history. It integrates it. The same sensitivity that once scanned for danger can now detect subtle inner truths. The same capacity for care can now extend inward. Emotional sovereignty does not isolate. It liberates. It allows love to be given freely rather than out of fear. It invites relationships based on choice rather than compulsion. It restores energy previously spent on hypervigilance. Ultimately, healing through self-attunement is a return to the self that existed before adaptation became necessary. It is the recognition that survival strategies were once essential but are no longer required in the same way. By reclaiming attention, honoring internal experience, and practicing steady boundaries, the individual moves from living reactively to living consciously. In this state, empathy and autonomy coexist. Care flows in both directions, and emotional sovereignty becomes not an act of defiance, but an expression of wholeness rooted in self-awareness and intentional connection.